June 12, 1944. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The air hung thick with the scent of red clay, baked under a sun that pressed down like a smouldering iron, heat shimmering off the corrugated roofs of the barracks, distorting the barbed wire into wavering black threads. Cicadas soared the afternoon into fragments of sound, their rhythm broken only by the distant clang of a mess tin, and the low murmur of voices speaking in guttural German, punctuated by the occasional sharp command in crisp Southern English. Inside Hut 7B, tucked beneath a cot, wrapped in mildewed canvas, Karl Reinhardt knelt on splintered floorboards. Fingers smudged with charcoal scraped from the edge of a burnt twig, sketching the outline of a face not his own. Broad jaw, narrow eyes, a scar splitting the left eyebrow like a lightning strike. Sergeant Jack Lowell, the guard who had tossed him a dry sock during his first rainstorm in camp, then barked, "Don't get soft on me, Fritz," before striding off into the dusk. Karl didn't understand then why he'd saved the image in his mind, why it had returned at night behind his eyelids, more vivid than memories of home. But now, with a stub of pencil traded for 3 cigarettes and a scrap of butcher paper pilfered from the mess hall, he drew it again, carefully, compulsively, as if rendering the lines might unknot something coiled tight in his chest. Outside, thunder rumbled, not from the sky but from the diesel generators powering the camp's perimeter lights, casting long, trembling shadows across the plywood walls. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the tin roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Karl tucked the sketch beneath his mattress just as the door creaked open. Lowell stood silhouetted in the doorway, cap pulled low, rainwater dripping from the brim onto his shoulders. "You," he said, not unkindly, "still scribbling ghosts." Karl didn't answer. He stood slowly, hands visible, palms out, the universal gesture of the powerless. Lowell's eyes flicked to the cot, to the barely visible corner of paper, then back to Karl's face. A silence stretched thick, with everything unsaid. The miles between Berlin and Birmingham, the dog tags Karl had buried in the latrine trench, the fact that his younger brother was probably rotting in a field near Caen right now, if the rumors were true. "Keep your head down," Lowell finally muttered, turning away. "Art won't feed you when the war's over." But Karl knew it already had. That night, as lightning flashed through the cracks in the wall, illuminating the faces of sleeping men, some snoring, some weeping softly into their blankets, he took out the sketch again and added eyes, not hard, not cold, but tired, human. And in that quiet act of seeing, not hating, something shifted inside him, imperceptible at first, like the first tremor before an earthquake. By dawn, he had begun another portrait, this time of Corporal Evans, the medic who'd stitched his hand after a brawl in the yard, humming "You Are My Sunshine" under his breath as he worked. Karl didn't know if painting his captors was madness or mercy, rebellion or surrender. All he knew was that every stroke pulled him further from the boy who had cheered Hitler in '38, further from the numbness that had settled over him after Stalingrad, further from the rage that had kept him alive, but was slowly eating him from the inside out. He painted not to flatter, not to beg, but to remember that men, even those wearing enemy uniforms, had faces, histories, wounds of their own, and in the monochrome world of a POW camp, color became his quiet mutiny. Weeks passed, and Karl's cache of portraits grew, a hidden archive beneath the floorboards, each sheet a small defiance against the erasure of identity that captivity demanded. He traded sketches for sugar, for extra rations, once even for a sliver of real soap, but never for favors, never for freedom. That would have tainted the work. The act itself was the anchor. He noticed things others missed. How Private Jenkins tapped his foot to silent music when he thought no one was looking. How Captain Whitmore's hands trembled slightly when he signed daily reports. How the cook, Big Lou, always left an extra biscuit near the fence for the stray dog with 3 legs. These were not enemies to Karl anymore, not in the way propaganda had taught him. They were patterns of humanity, flickers in the grey. One afternoon, while hauling sacks of flour to the mess hall, Karl overheard two officers discussing the upcoming transfer of high-value prisoners to a stricter camp in Oklahoma. "Reinhardt's on the list," one said. "Too quiet, too observant, doesn't fit the mold." Karl's blood ran cold. Observation, once his salvation, now marked him as a threat. That night, under the dim glow of a smuggled candle stub, he painted faster than ever, capturing the weary kindness in Lowell's eyes, the freckles scattered across Evan's nose like stars. He knew he might lose everything in the transfer, his paper, his pencils, his fragile piece. But what he didn't know was that Lowell had seen him drawing again, this time through the slats in the storage shed, and had taken note not of the content, but of the consistency, the sheer volume, the precision, the lack of caricature. A week later, during roll call, Lowell pulled Karl aside. "You draw Americans like you know us," he said, voice low. "Why?" Karl met his gaze. "Because if I paint you as monsters, I become one too." Lowell didn't respond, but the next day, Karl's name vanished from the transfer list. No explanation, no fanfare, just silence and survival. Yet institutional suspicion didn't vanish so easily. Major Griggs, the camp's intelligence officer, had been monitoring Karl for months, convinced the portraits were coded messages, maps disguised as faces. "Artists are spies with softer tools," he told Lowell during a late-night briefing, his voice laced with bourbon and bias. "Reinhardt's not sketching for therapy. He's cataloging weaknesses." Lowell argued back, not with logic, but with instinct. "He draws the way some men pray. You don't interrupt prayer with handcuffs." Still, Griggs ordered increased surveillance, and Karl's movements were restricted. His art supplies were confiscated twice. Each time, he began again with whatever he could find. Ash mixed with saliva, ink from a crushed beetle, even blood from a paper cut. The portraits grew more urgent, more detailed, as if he were racing against time itself. Then came the letter, from Berlin, forwarded through the Red Cross. His parents' apartment had been reduced to rubble in a firebombing raid. No survivors. Karl didn't cry. He painted. For 3 days straight, he worked in silence, producing a single image, not of destruction, but of his mother's hands kneading dough, sunlight catching the flour like snow. He gave it to Evans, saying only, "This is what I lost." Evans stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into his tunic without a word. Something had changed, not just in Karl, but in the air between captor and captive. The portraits were no longer just his secret. They were becoming a bridge, invisible but real, built one careful line at a time. By late August, rumors swirled through Camp Aliceville like dust devils. Germany was crumbling. Paris had fallen, the Allies were pushing east with terrifying speed. For the prisoners, hope and dread tangled in equal measure. Would they be repatriated? Tried as war criminals? Forgotten in some remote camp for decades? Karl felt none of these extremes. He felt only the weight of the next stroke, the next face. But his work had not gone unnoticed beyond the wire. A visiting Red Cross inspector, an art historian from Geneva, spotted one of Karl's sketches pinned discreetly to Evans' bulletin board, a tender study of a young private writing a letter home, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is extraordinary," the inspector murmured. "Who made this?" Evans, after a moment's hesitation, revealed Karl's name. Within days, a quiet inquiry reached Washington. Could a POW's artistic output be leveraged for psychological re-education? The Office of War Information, already experimenting with morale campaigns, saw potential. But Major Griggs vehemently opposed any soft approach, calling it naive, dangerous. "You give a man a pencil, he'll draw you a map to sabotage," he insisted during a classified teleconference. Yet Lowell, now quietly promoted to head of internal affairs, submitted a counter-proposal. Allow Karl to create a series of portraits of American soldiers, real ones, not caricatures, for exhibition in military hospitals and USO centers. Not propaganda, he argued. Testimony. Proof that even in war, recognition is possible. After weeks of bureaucratic wrangling, permission was granted, conditionally. Karl would work under supervision. No names, no unit insignia, no distribution without clearance. On September 3rd, 1944, Karl was ushered into a small, whitewashed room near the infirmary, handed a set of proper charcoal pencils, watercolor cakes, and thick cotton paper. His first official subject was a wounded GI recovering from D-Day injuries. Private Daniel Reyes, missing 2 fingers, eyes still holding the 1,000-yard stare. Karl didn't speak. He simply sat, observed, and began. The result stunned even Lowell. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't sanitized. It showed Reyes' exhaustion, the tension in his jaw, but also the faint curve of a smile as he read a letter from his sister. When shown to Camp Commandant Colonel Hargrove, the colonel stood silent for nearly a minute before saying, "This man sees the soul behind the uniform." That's rare. That's useful. Encouraged, Karl painted faster. Medics, cooks, truck drivers, radio operators, ordinary men like himself, bearing the invisible weight of a global cataclysm. Each portrait became a mirror not just for the subject, but for the viewer. This could be you. This pain is shared. The series, quietly titled Faces in the Fog, began circulating in Army field hospitals by October. Soldiers recovering from trauma would stare at the paintings and whisper, "That's me." Nurses reported calmer wards, fewer nightmares. A chaplain in Normandy wrote that the images restored a sense of shared dignity. Yet back in Alabama, Griggs seethed. He launched an investigation, demanding to know how a Nazi could so accurately depict American vulnerability. Karl was interrogated 3 times. Each time he answered with the same quiet truth. "I paint what I see, not what I'm told to see." The interrogators found no evidence of subversion, only an unsettling empathy. And empathy in wartime was often mistaken for treason. Winter came early to Alabama in 1944, frost silvering the barbed wire at dawn, the air sharp enough to make lungs ache. Karl's hands, chapped and cracked from the cold, still moved with precision across the paper, now producing not just portraits, but small watercolor scenes. GIs playing cards in a tent, a cook stirring stew over a fire, a sentry gazing at the stars. These were smuggled out not by design, but by necessity. Evans carried one to a military hospital in Birmingham. Lowell mailed another to a USO organizer in Chicago. Word spread. Requests poured in, not from generals, but from chaplains, nurses, families of missing soldiers. "Can you draw him as if he's still here?" one mother wrote. Karl, with permission now grudgingly extended, began accepting names, descriptions, even photographs. He painted the lost as if they were standing in the room, alive, weary, human. No medals, no flags, just faces. In January 1945, Faces in the Fog was quietly exhibited at Walter Reed Hospital. The response was overwhelming. Soldiers in casts and bandages lingered for hours before the portraits. A blind veteran traced the raised lines of charcoal with his fingertips and said, "I can feel his sadness." The War Department, sensing a morale tool too potent to ignore, approved wider distribution, but with a caveat. Karl's identity as a German POW was to remain classified. The artist would be listed only as KR European Observer. Karl didn't care. Recognition was never the point. What mattered was that his hands, once trained to load rifles, now made something that healed. Then came the true test. In March 1945, a transport ship carrying wounded GIs from Le Havre to New York was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland, except it wasn't. German U-boats had largely withdrawn from the Atlantic by then, but fear lingered. Panic spread through the military. Had a new wolf pack emerged? Intelligence scrambled for answers. Meanwhile, at Camp Aliceville, Karl received a letter from a survivor, a young medic who'd clung to a life raft for 2 days. He described the ship's final moments. No explosion, no periscope, just a sudden, violent listing, then silence. "It felt like the ocean swallowed us whole," he wrote. Karl, studying the account, noticed something odd. The ship's engines had cut out abruptly before the sinking, like someone pulled a plug. That detail echoed a conversation he'd overheard months earlier between 2 Navy officers visiting the camp about faulty bilge pumps in Liberty ships causing catastrophic flooding. He brought his observation to Lowell. What if it wasn't a U-boat? What if it was mechanical failure and we're blaming ghosts? Lowell, skeptical but intrigued, passed the note up the chain. Within days, naval engineers re-examined the wreck. They found no torpedo damage. Instead, a corroded weld in the engine room had ruptured under pressure, flooding the hull in minutes. The attack had been an accident. Karl's insight, born not from training but from listening, from painting men who spoke of ships like they spoke of lovers, had prevented a costly reallocation of anti-submarine resources in the war's final weeks. For the first time, Griggs said nothing. He simply watched Karl return to his easel, brush hovering over a new canvas, a portrait of a young German POW, eyes wide with fear, staring out from behind barbed wire. It was a self-portrait, and it was the first time Karl had painted himself. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, at Camp Aliceville. The news arrived not with cheers, but with a hollow silence, as if the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. Karl packed his few belongings, his remaining pencils, a worn sketchbook, the small watercolor set the Red Cross had gifted him. His portraits, hundreds of them, were boxed and shipped to Washington under military escort, destined for archives, museums, perhaps oblivion. He never asked where they went. He never sought credit. When Lowell offered to write a commendation, Karl shook his head. I did what kept me sane, nothing more. On the morning of his repatriation, June 18, 1945, Lowell met him at the gate. Rain fell softly, the same kind that had drummed on the roof the night Karl drew his first American face. You changed more minds than you know, Lowell said, handing him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a set of professional oil paints, cadmium red, ultramarine, titanium white, the kind Karl had only dreamed of using. Paint the truth, Lowell said. Wherever you are. Karl nodded, tucked the package under his arm, and walked through the gate without looking back. Back in a shattered Berlin, he opened a small studio above a bakery that barely survived the bombing. He painted not for governments or galleries, but for those who came quietly, a widow wanting to remember her husband's smile, a child who'd never seen her father in uniform, a former soldier who needed to see himself as something other than broken. His style never changed. No grand battles, no flags, no heroes on horseback, just faces. By 1950, Faces in the Fog resurfaced, not as wartime propaganda, but as a human document. Exhibited in New York, London, even Bonn, it was praised for its uncanny empathy, its refusal to see the other as less than human. Yet Karl rarely attended openings. He preferred the quiet scrape of charcoal on paper, the smell of linseed oil, the moment when a subject's tension softened because they felt seen. He never spoke of his time as a POW, not even to his wife, whom he married in '48 after painting her portrait during a community art night. When asked in later years why he'd painted his captors instead of his comrades, he would only say, "Hatred is a cage. I chose to open the door." He died in 1987, largely unknown outside art circles. But in military hospitals, VA centers, and quiet corners of history, his work endures, a testament not to victory, but to the quiet courage of seeing clearly in a world determined to blur the lines. And in every brushstroke, the unspoken truth remains. Sometimes the most radical act in war is not to destroy, but to depict.